Hey there guys, and welcome to another Ask Exterminator video. In this series, you guys ask me questions and I answer them. So if you have a question you'd like me to answer, next week leave it in the comments of this video that you're watching right now. Currently I'm answering questions left in last week's video. So it can be Factorio related, game related, just unrelated to any of that, just anything you want to ask me and want answered, as long as it's appropriate enough for me to answer on YouTube. But there we go. So we're gonna get started here. Some good questions as always. Fred G asks, what type of questions do you like to answer? What questions, answered or unanswered, interest you in general? And that is a really good, cool thing you asked. I think personally, like what the types of questions I like to answer. I mean, I like answering all the questions really, but the types I prefer the most and the ones that interest me the most are um, either ones related to like philosophies in the game, like what like some of the questions where people ask, what are your thoughts on this aspect of the game, or what do you think should be improved about the game, or what do you think's wrong with the game, etc. Stuff like that. And then also just questions about me or just non-game related stuff. Obviously that the other everything's fine, but I think just I really enjoy the most answering questions. I think about things in the real world that whether it be about me or my life or my opinion on something else. I just kind of think those are the most interesting to me. Just because I do Factorio all the time. I game all the time. I stream. I talk about it all the time. So kind of just stepping out of that realm is really the most interesting to me. Again, I'm not saying all the questions have to be unrelated to that. Certainly not. But that is what interests me the most and what I enjoy answering the most is questions like that are just not necessarily gaming or Factorio related. Um, Wosi or Woase J, I think. Woozy, maybe. I'm sorry, I'm really bad with names. Says, hi, I'm building my first Megabase from my starter. How many smelting arrays do you think is suitable amount per resource? Love your content. Well, thank you very much, and congrats on starting your first Megabase. Your question, I think, is a little vague, or maybe your goal in general is a little vague. Because you say you're starting your first Megabase, and you want to know how many smelting arrays are suitable for each resource. But I would kind of answer your question with another question. I know this isn't very helpful, but is like, what is your goal? Right? Because that right there should kind of answer your question for you. At least in my experience, I've never built a megabase without some sort of goal in mind, because to me, it seems kind of pointless and I just lose interest and don't really have a clue what I'm doing if I'm just like, oh, I'm going to build a megabase for no reason, really. I'm just going to build one. And if that's your style, then go for it. Like, I'm not criticizing. But I think if you give yourself a goal, like, I want to do this many science packs per minute, 500, 1,000, 5,000, whatever. Or I want to launch this amount of rockets per minute. Or I want to, make 20,000 power armors or whatever. Whatever you want your goal to be, that alone should basically answer the question of how many smelting arrays you need, because you could either manually do the math, or there's multiple like online and even in-game calculators where you like input. They're usually just for science packs per minute or rockets per minute, because that's the standard really. Where you input those numbers, like say you input 500 science per minute of every science, and it will tell you how much iron and how much copper you need per minute, and then you can kind of build your smelting arrays to that. I guess to try my best to actually give you an answer, it's just so hard because I don't know what you're working towards, really. I mean, a megabase, I would say, hypothetically, if you're doing belt megabase, maybe like uh, enough smelter, like enough iron smelters to fill like 8 blue belts of iron, and then maybe enough copper to fill like 10 or 12 blue belts of copper. I don't, again, I don't really know what you're working towards. So, um, and yeah, the reason there is more copper than iron is because late game you do need more copper generally than iron because of all the low density structures and all the circuits you need, which require a lot of copper and stuff like that. So yeah, maybe if you clarify, I can certainly give you a more specific answer next week. Um, but yeah, for now, I don't really have a better answer, unfortunately. Fred G asks, another question from him asks, are you still planning on doing those Lego streams you were talking about? Yeah, so on my stream, for anyone who's unaware, I've talked before about doing Lego streams where I will stream like building Lego, whether it be, mocks, my own creations, like just my own builds or sets, because that's something I'm really interested in is Lego, and I do still plan on doing it. I did answer Fred like replied to his comment, basically right when he asked it, but answering it publicly here. I do plan to do it. A lot of it's time constraints, but also I was shopping around to try to find a USB extension, like a good one, a long one, because I have like a little building station set up in my closet. It's a decent sized closet, so I have like a building station set up in there, and I want my webcam to be able to reach from my computer, which is obviously not in my closet. So I needed like a 15-foot, 16-foot extension USB extension cable that like wasn't going to lose quality really over the distance. So I was trying to figure that out. I did order one. It's here. So now it's more of just when do I want to do it. But yes, I certainly do. Ultra says, can you please, this is more of a request, but says, can you please do a mod spotlight on the mod factory planner? You have a mod spotlight on about a year ago, but it's vastly outdated. Yeah, so on my Reddit weekly, I saw like the new update for it and mentioned I do want to do a spotlight on it. I thought I had, and I guess I have, because it did seem familiar, but yes, so I do plan to. I'm not sure when, but I do plan to. SKSKE asks, are sick, I don't know. Says, what would you say is the number one tip to saving UPS on the Megabase scale? This is a really interesting question. See, this question I find difficult, but also very interesting. Hmm. Well, this one's going to seem obvious, so I'll give you two answers. The first one is use modules and beacons. And that may seem like a dumb answer, but you would be surprised the number of people who build a megabase and don't beacon or module any of their stuff. Or they module it and then don't beacon it, which is actually worse than just not doing either, usually. So, because it saves on space, like it makes your design smaller because they're faster and give you more productivity. And that's good whether you're using bots or belts, because it means less belts, right? If you have a smaller build, and it means less bots if your build's smaller because they have to travel less distance. So that'd be the first one, the big one. If you're not doing that, definitely use speed modules in all of your beacons, and then productivity modules in your machines where they can be used. They can only be used on intermediate products. Anything that can't have them used, like, I'm trying to think, for example, like inserters, like for green science, can't use productivity modules. Then you put speed modules in the machines and still speed beacon it. Then like one machine will supply like a ton of science. So that's number one. Number two, oof, that's a little difficult because they've done so many optimizations since the last time I built a big mega base. I think I'm trying to think on like what is actually the most performance heavy. I would still lean towards it being fluids. Honestly, on a megabase scale, especially as you get really big megabase into like needing like tens of gigawatts of power, I would say the next biggest thing is don't build nuclear. And that may upset some people because nuclear is super cool. It is. But man, once you start getting those big nuclear builds, it will tank your UPS. Um, Again, you could do it like if you're just making like a 500,000 signs per minute base, then you could probably just run that on nuclear. It wouldn't be a huge deal. Unless you're on a very slow computer, you probably wouldn't be below 60 UPS anyway. But if you're like getting into the really big mega base where you need like literally tens of gigawatts of power, um, like 10, 20, 30, 50 gigawatts of power. Definitely, I know solar. I know stamping down that much solar is a pain. You could just use a cheaty power source if you want. I don't really, personally, I don't consider that an issue because, who wants to stamp down millions of solar panels? Yeah, nuclear, don't build nuclear. That is, as much as I hate to say it, that would be the next one. So those are my top two. Um, So, okay, so this is kind of a long question, but I actually really like it. Ultra asks, When 015 first released with the infinite science and universal barreling barrels, could hold so much more fluid than they do currently. They got nerfed very heavily. Yeah, this at some point after 015, I think they nerfed barrels pretty heavily. He says, I remember that you had a very strong opinion about the nerf. It ruined your sitting support as a space megabase. It did. I basically, I had to install a mod to be able to run it because I depended on barrels before the nerf, and the nerf basically just destroyed all the fluid stuff in the base. You said that barrels were very much useless back then. He says, what do you think about barrels now, since it has been a few years since the nerf and your knowledge about the game has improved? Were your hatred towards the nerf justified, or did you overreact? No, I don't think I overreacted. I think barrels are still horrible. For most things, like for a large amount of fluid transport in logistics, I think barrels are still terrible. I think I don't think they're useless completely. So maybe, if I was totally enraged and said they were completely useless back then maybe I overreacted a little bit. I think they can be good in some cases, for sure. But if you're on a megabase or even before megabase scale, if you're trying to move a ton of liquid specifically via train, right? If you're loading your train with barrels, and this is what I was doing in sending support to space, because this is what this barrels were a lot better back then before they nerfed it. So I was transporting basically all my intermediate fluids, not crude oil that was on tanker wagons, but all the of lube and stuff like that. I was transporting via barrels and trains, a huge amount of it. This was a 4,000 science per minute base. And it worked well. The barrels were really good, and it let me have a little better control over the fluid management, because I could use circuit conditions and stuff for keep X amount of barrels, blah blah blah. But I still think they're terrible for that. After the nerf, I would never use them in that instance right now, because the barrels, I think, they just don't hold enough fluid. The devs nerfed them really hard, and I think that they're still useless in that regard. Again, for small things, I think they can be decent for sure. The other problem with barrels, and this had nothing to do with the nerf, but just in general, the other part of the barrels is you have to make the barrels and the empty ones, and then part of the problem logistically is you have to, you bring the full barrel somewhere and they get emptied, and then you have to transport the empty barrels back so that you can, unless you want to just make infinite barrels, so then you can bring them back to be filled. I was obviously doing that sending supports to space. It wasn't that huge of a deal. But since they were good, I used them. But if you combine that challenge with the fact that I think they're crap for the amount of fluids they hold, then I think they're pretty bad, honestly. Let me see here. So let me see. Oh yeah, so here's one. I answered a question last time about someone having plastic bottlenecks. So why Lipoli, I think, asks, regarding your answer to the plastic problem, do you hate coal liquefaction? That is how I always do it late game. No, I don't hate coal liquefaction. To be honest, a lot of times I forget it's even a thing. I think it's okay. The thing is, sure, it can be made just from coal, but you also need water there, and then you also need to set up steam, which, it's not once you set it up, it just goes, but I'd have to look at the numbers again. I think it's still better to just produce plastic from normal oil processing, so I would prefer to just go get oil rather than find a coal patch that also is by water. I guess I could bring coal into my base and do the liquefaction somewhere in my base that has water. I just don't really see a huge benefit to it unless you just have a ton of coal and no oil, and then yeah, it's good. That's kind of why it exists. Is if on your map you just happen to have a ton of coal and you have no oil, then it's really good. And then I would think it would be really good. So if you're in that case, I think in that situation, I think it's pretty good. Origami Phoenix says, what are your favorite foods? And what are your most favorite restaurants for vegetarian meals if you go out to eat at all? Yeah, so I've mentioned this. I'm a vegetarian. See, these are the kind of questions I love, especially food, because I love food. To answer your first question, origami. My favorite kinds of food are kind of in no particular order. Well, mostly in order. Top, Indian food. Absolutely love Indian food. Like absolutely love it. It doesn't really love me that much. Like it's really rich. I definitely, I definitely kind of regret eating it afterwards. But I still do because I love Indian food. I also really like Chinese and Thai food. I have to be really careful with that though because they put like fish oil or oyster oil in like everything. So we have found a few places. My girlfriend and I actually just found a new place like a month ago that is probably the best Thai food I've ever eaten in my life. And it's and they do put oyster oil and stuff normally, but you can request to not have it put in, and they will honor that. And I believe they honor that because I haven't got sick from it yet, and normally that would make me sick. So those are like my top two. I really like basically all cuisines. Mexican food I like, or I mean, Tex-Mex. Like, I mean, most Mexican food you find in America isn't really truly Mexican food. I guess that could be said for most everything. But I am in America, so I'll just say the Mexican food I find around here. Yeah, also Tex-Mex stuff like Qdoba. I really like Qdoba. I love sandwiches too. Like I mean, I could just give you a whole list, but yeah. And then my favorite restaurants for vegetarian meals is definitely again um, Indian food, Indian cuisine in general, at least most of it, like that I find at least around my area, is very vegetarian friendly. Like they have a very large selection of meals, of entrees and stuff that are just naturally vegetarian. Like whether it be like lentil dishes or like some sort of like cheese in a cream sauce stuff, which is like what I like. Uh, all kinds of appetizers that are vegetarian friendly. I mean, I just listed two entrees, but there's a ton. Like a spinach sag paneer, which is like cheese chunk, like paneer cheese chunks, and like a spinach, kind of a creamy spinach sauce, or like mix is really good. Indian food in general, I think, is just very vegetarian friendly. And there's a place in my city in Denver. If anyone ever comes to Denver or lives near Denver, highly recommend. There's a place called India's Restaurant. It's the longest standing Indian restaurant in Denver. It's been around for I think 30 years or at least. My parents have been going there for like 25 years. And when I got old enough, they started taking me there. I've been going there for like 15, 16 years straight. And keep in mind, this is like once a month or once every other month, not like once a year type thing. And it's so good every single time, super consistent, absolutely love it. And then like I said, Thai food and Chinese food I really love, and those are some of my favorite places for vegetarian food, as long as I'm careful, as long as I confirm and be like, hey, is there fish oil, oyster oil in this, blah blah blah. But a lot of times, they have a lot of tofu dishes, which can be vegetarian friendly, usually fried rice, stuff like that, usually some vegetarian egg rolls, things like that. um, yeah, I think, sandwich places, usually you can get at least one or two vegetarian sandwiches. Places like that, Qdoba, you can be very vegetarian friendly because you can basically just put whatever you want on it. And they do obviously have non-meat options. Um, so yeah, those are kind of some of my favorites. Hope that answers your question. I really enjoy answering these questions. I could talk about food for another 20 minutes. um, Foundation Afro says, if you get really large bases, do you need to start building secondary or even tertiary main buses as you run out of resources at your original? Or should you just build lines from resource patches to your original bus? How long do you need to go to those far out resources? This is a really good question. First off, I would say definitely bringing the resources from the ore patches into your base is your best bet. Either by belt or train, depending on how far they are and how many resources you need and which you prefer. I usually prefer trains. Um, I've never really done much with like building multiple, like actual multiple bases for like, and then bringing resources to them. Once you get to like a megabase scale, it can make sense to do like production at an outpost, like find an iron outpost and like smelt the iron ore at that patch and then make gears from it like at that patch. But that's really for megabase scale and stuff. For like, I mean, you said large bases, but like this, it can certainly be done the other way too. Like you could just have one huge megabase and just bring stuff in from the patches. So really, like if you're building with, you mentioned main bus specifically. If you're using a main bus system, I don't think it really makes sense to do the outpost production thing that much. And then like how long until you need to go to those far out resources is kind of a hard thing to answer. I would say just as soon as you need the resources, like um, you know, if the ones around your base and stuff just aren't satisfactory or sufficient in terms of their richness and size, then definitely go farther out looking until you find one that you think is going to work, and then grab that. So all that answers your question. Yeah, I would say if you're, especially if you're building a main bus, definitely like try to bring the resources in from the patches to the base. Um, and then Hydride asks, would you consider a smaller car base? Like would I consider it? Would I consider building one? I assume this is what the question means. Probably not. I'm not really a fan of that. Like I think it's cool. Like it's really innovative. I don't personally think I would ever like building like that though. So probably not. Um. Okay, so this is another one. Den from Earth asks, what is your opinion with buffering items throughout the base? I'm working on my first rocket launch by designing each individual build off a main bus. I enjoy laying out my next setup, rebuilding, optimizing, and blueprinting, but I can spend a lot of time doing this. This means idle trains with full cargo wagons sitting at my outposts. I think buffering the ore before the silent full belts and smelters is a good idea. I don't think we'll transfer to a megabase this map, and we'll keep my main bus to the rocket launch. What's your advice on buffers for this playthrough and in general? Personally, I'm not a huge fan of buffers. Now, I think it's perfectly fine to just buffer at your train station, like load your stuff. In fact, I highly recommend unloading, well, loading at your outpost, and then in base unloading from your train into chests, like even steel chests, the biggest chests you can build. You know, probably 4 to 6 of them per cargo wagon, and I think that is a sufficient buffer. If you are just tearing through resources somehow faster than your train is getting back, you could add another row of chests, although personally, I would say your best bet is to just go get more ore and have another train come in, because more buffer doesn't really help. If you're eating through resources so fast that like a set of like 4 to 6 chests per wagon on a train unload is being eaten before the train gets back, that's an indication that you don't have enough resources coming in, not an indication that you don't have enough storage. So, and that's the case a lot of times. Like, and that's why I don't really like buffers, like, aside from just train unloading, really, because, like, they can hide problems, they can mask problems, right? Like, for example, let's just say you have a buffer of iron ore, you know, or iron plate if you're doing it farther in production. You said throughout the base, and you have a buffer that can hold, say, oh, I don't know, 50,000, and you like are messing with stuff, like, so it gets full. You're messing with stuff in your base, so your base slows down, and it just kind of slowly pulls from the buffer, and you're like, okay, wow, this is cool. I have enough resources coming in. My buffer's full. And then you turn on production. And lo and behold, you actually don't have near enough resources coming in because your buffer gave you the false idea that you actually did, because it was full, because you were barely using it at the time, like temporarily. But then when your base is actually going full tilt, it's just being emptied way before the resources come in, which usually isn't the end of the world. You can just go get more. But that's generally why I don't like buffers more than just when you unload into out of a train, or like 1 or 2 tanks of liquid buffer. I just think it kind of gives like a false sense of how many resources you have coming in and if it's enough and stuff like that. Yeah. So like I'm just rereading your question here to myself. It seems like the reason you're maybe doing buffers, you say, is because you like to kind of rebuild and then optimize and blueprint, and it can take a lot of time. But the thing is, like, I don't think you really need a buffer while you do that. You know, like have a small buffer, and like from directly from when you unload from the train, and then just or if you're doing belts, I suppose you could put a small buffer, but really the belt itself is the buffer. And the resources will just sit there. Like that's okay. They'll just sit there in the small buffer until you're done, and then when you turn it on, then the buffer will empty and things will go on their way. Um, I don't think you necessarily need to have like a huge stockpile. Hopefully that answers your question. Uh, Blagme says, Exterminator, have you thought about doing a diagonal ribbon world? I don't know if this is a troll question. No. I wouldn't consider. I've not really even wanted to do a normal ribbon world. There's no way in hell I'm gonna do a diagonal one. Um. So yeah, that's my answer. No. um. Last question from Chris Glacier says, vaguely on the topic of what society is missing, which was a question asked by Fred G, I think, last episode. If you didn't watch that, check it out. He says, what do you think would be the most effective way to drop the world's overpopulation issue and keep it at a sustainable level? Well, I have an inappropriate answer that I shouldn't say. I'm not going to say that. Uh, I mean, the most effective. There's a difference between the most effective and the most realistic and, um, like humane. Um, I mean, dropping the world's population. I mean, that's honestly the best way to do both, to drop the world's population and keep it at a sustainable level, is to, um, in some form or another, limit like how many kids people can have. Like that may sound really mean and bad, but that's literally that's a pretty common thing in some places. Like I think for a while at some point China was doing that or is doing that. I think um, because naturally people die, which obviously lowers the population. And if kids, new humans are only being born at the speed at which people die, or close to it, or less. So if you want to drop the population, it would need to be less. And then if you want to kind of keep it at a sustainable level, it would need to be about the same rate. Obviously, it can't be exact, but generally. The problem being, well, the problem being that there's two problems. The problem is that people are being born faster than people are dying, and there's two reasons for that. Maybe more than two, really, when you really go into it. Number one is I think a lack of limitation of how many kids people can have. Now I'm not saying I'm necessarily like, I'm not saying you shouldn't have kids, but like, there are places and stuff where people are just having three, four, five, six kids, and when you add that up over thousands and thousands, millions of families, like, you know, it gets pretty crazy. So people are being born faster than people dying because people are just having a ton of kids, and then also, and this is the other thing. This is like really controversial, I think, and a dilemma really is as time goes forward, as our technology advances and medicine advances, people are living longer, right? Like people live a lot longer now than they did 100 years ago, 200 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, probably. One, because, in general, we are treating illnesses better aside from, current situation. And, there's more ways to keep people alive for longer, etc. So you combine those two things. So that's a problem, is you have just our modern medicine, technology, whatever, keeping people alive longer, and then more people being born, or even if it were just the same amount of people being born as 20 or 30 years ago, people are staying alive longer. So in general, the population is going up, and it's really difficult because it's like, like who, most people are not going to be in favor of like of not staying alive longer, right? Most people are not going to be in favor of like just stopping any like development and research into longer lifespans. Most people want to live longer. Most people don't want to die, like, generally. So it's like, that's kind of the problem, right? So really the most effective way, in my opinion, is kind of do it on the other end, is, as unfortunate as it is, limit how, put limits and constraints on how many, on the amount of people that can be born, on the amount of kids people can have. I'm not by any means saying have, tell a whole society they can't have kids. No, but limiting one to however many, again, I'm not super expert on that. That's just kind of my thoughts. And yeah, I'm not, I'm looking at some of the replies to this. Yeah, I don't know. So that's my answer. Yeah, I think that's my best answer there. I could really go into it, but even that is kind of, even what I've said is kind of maybe going a little too much into stuff for what may be good here. But yeah, that's the questions for today, guys. It was a bit of a long one, but some really great questions. So thank you so much for asking them. If you have questions you'd like me to answer for next week, put them in the comments of this video, and I will go ahead and answer them for you. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, like is appreciated as well. And if you're new to the channel and aren't subscribed, please consider doing so to keep up with all the videos. And make sure to hit the notification bell as well to be notified of my new videos. Anyway, take care, guys. Until next time, I look forward to seeing you all, and do take care.